was during my 200-hour yoga teacher training. I remember we were all learning how to hop back from crow pose into chaturanga. And I remember being sandwiched between like two of my friends that were once strangers that became good friends throughout the training. And we all were trying so hard. We're like, okay, we're gonna do this. And we all just belly flopped to the floor so hard. And we're just like on our bellies laughing on the floor. And that moment just like seared into my brain as such a silly part. And I often like to say to my students that eating shit is a rite of passage.
Yeah, that's so funny. Does it bring a flashback when you're teaching the same, anything like that?
Absolutely. Whenever I see students going for it, and as many do on their first attempt, you can see the determination and then the belly flop happen. And it always makes me think of that time like, hey, like I was there too. Okay, we all are going to do that before we stick it the first time. But in that process, it's how we learn.
I think they've all had those. So
Those moments. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes if people can see, especially on Instagram, people's practice, it's like, wow, they make it look so effortless. And it's like, I can guarantee you, anyone who makes anything look effortless has had so many falls on the path to making it look that way that it's not effortless to start.
tell me something. Now, if you see a student who's on the same path and you're watching the student class after class try things out, really get adventurous with poses, do you prefer to let them stay on that path and figure it out? Or do you step in the way, and try to make it safer for them? What's your approach like?
Yeah, I think it depends, right, on what they're doing. If it looks like they're forcing themselves into something that's beyond what their body is capable of in an unsafe way, then it's like, hey, can I show you how to do that differently? And then that's a great teaching moment. But if someone is going for something and maybe it's a little out of reach, but it's not inherently dangerous what they're trying, I'll let them try it. And I often like to teach in the layers if it is in like a group teaching experience where I like to talk about curiosity. Like, oh, we may curiously try out a layer to see how far we can go. And then we can be honest with ourselves. Is this a good spot to stay, or should we go back to the previous layer? Because I think one of the things we need to do to progress is to try things we can't do. But then we can be honest, like, okay, should I stay in these efforts or should I pull back a little bit and work on some foundations to then help the next thing unfold with more ease?
That's interesting. Okay, I want to understand this before I get into the layers and what you shared just now. Let's say if you had a class to take tomorrow, a 60-minute yoga session focused on asanas, and you don't know who is coming for the class. It's all a bunch of new students. You don't know anything about them. You can teach any style that you like. How would you go about planning this class out?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question that I got really good firsthand experience with when I was living in Indonesia. I was living on a tiny island with a ton of come and go tourism. And so it was rare for me to have regular students who were there. Like if someone was there for a week, that was like a long time. Whereas before, I was more used to having regular students. So I knew who was coming and I could cater my classes more specifically to them. So when I think about teaching in layers, I think that becomes even more important when you are teaching a random group of people where you literally have no idea their skill set. And there can be a wide range of students from people who have never moved their body in their life to people who love bouncing on their hands and everything in between. So from the very beginning, I like to have these initial check-in points where the students don't know it's a check-in point, but for me, it's an assessment of who's in the room this day and how can I cater to everyone. And I really love using plank and chaturanga in different layers towards the beginning of class as a assessment. And then now I've been teaching for so long, like I'm pretty good at adjusting things like on the fly. And I think that whenever I'm teaching any pose, I always know how can I make this harder and how can I make it easier. And based on this initial check-in, I know like, ooh, this is my sequence that I planned. And I either need to take it down or up or just teach more layers because there's such a mix of people in here. But I always like to take people through just a regular plank like, of course, I warm up their joints and stuff first, but plank is such a good check-in because if you bring your students into plank and everyone's already in a perfect plank, that tells you a lot. If you have students who are in a super saggy, collapsing plank, that also tells you a lot. And when you cue them to help refine their shape, if they're capable of finding a strong plank, that gives you some information. But even if you're helping them refine their shape and it's still not landing, that also gives you a lot of information of who is in the room that day. If that's looking good and I'll typically will break down the first chaturanga. I won't have it be a typical chaturanga. I'll typically will take students down to their belly so they could take an active cobra before an upward dog just to warm up the spine a little bit more and giving the option to take that active cobra instead of upward dog and seeing if who's taking which option. Are people going for up dog or are most people wanting a smaller back bend? Then if that's looking good, I'll take them just through a regular vinyasa and see how that flows. If that's looking good, I'll try adding on more layers. Two layers I like to add is a three-limbed plank to chaturanga. If people are, and I'll offer it as for a greater challenge, invitation to lift your right leg. And if people take that greater challenge, that tells me something that they're wanting more. If they take it and it looks good, that's telling me something. And if they take it and form breaks down, right? There's all these layers, and it's like, okay, I'm learning who's in the room. And then the last one I like to do is a hop back from a forward fold into a chaturanga. And again, learn that as an option to either step back or to hop back and seeing like, did anyone hop back or did no one go for the hop back option? And how did it look? Did they belly flop or did they land it really strong? And so in this initial phase of the class, I'm gathering all these different data points of assessing who is there. And from there, I have a pretty good idea of, okay, I'm dialing it down on what I planned, or I'm turning up the fire on what I planned. And of course, gauging it as the class unfolds itself. And sometimes it's a mix of both. Like, all right, I have a wide variety of students, so let me teach in more layers so the student who's new and has never done this before doesn't feel like they're left on the sidelines, but also the student who has a stronger physical practice and wants that challenge, they get that challenge. So those are my check-ins. It sounds kind of nuancy, but I like stuff like that.
I think it's genius what you've shared because um, I know of at least five teachers in my circle who struggle with reading the room exactly the way that you've been doing it, Maddie, and I think that's amazing. And I'm very sure that this has taken you a lot of trial and error, right? It hasn't happened overnight, right? So, um, were there any poses, any techniques that you tried before plank and the other vinyasas that did not work out the way that you had planned? And that's how you realized, okay, this doesn't work. This doesn't help me to read the room.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I had a method. I think I didn't have a method before I landed on this method. It was just like I would have a class planned and I'd be like, all right, this is the class I'm teaching. And then I would start teaching, and sometimes it'd be like, oh, this is like younger. I would start teaching and it would be, oh no, like these students can't even hold a warrior two. So let me completely scratch everything I had planned and just do everything from a knee down position. Or sometimes it'd be like, oh man, like I have some people balancing on their hands in my class and I need to up the challenge for them so they're not bored with this class. So I used to not have a method. I would always like plan a class rather than having check-ins in that class to see who's actually there. And so I think that's what led me to then figuring out how can I have an assessment of like, yes, plan your class of what you want to do, but then where are you checking in to see are the students in the room actually able to do that class that you had planned, or is it too easy or too hard for them, and how can you adjust?
Let's say if there was a day when everyone found the class very easy, what happens after such a class in terms of the feedback or the way the class responds? How does that go usually?
I think this is a little bit of a hot take, but something that I hear a lot of yoga teachers struggle with are feeling like their students are going rogue and not listening to instructions and just doing whatever they want. But my hot take is that that happens because you're not challenging them enough. And so I think a lot of times when we look at inclusivity, which I'm really big on, sometimes I think it could go too far on one spectrum of inclusivity of wanting to include newer students that we forget about people who have a stronger practice that also want to be challenged. And so if we're so focused only on the new students that we're not challenging the stronger physical students, is that actually being inclusive, or are we also excluding them and some of their needs? And so I think that's why if you have a class where it's like, oh, everyone's going rogue and there's people doing all these different crazy things, I think as a teacher, that's your sign of how can I add on more challenge so the student is actually being challenged and held by my guidance rather than feeling like, oh, this isn't enough for me, so I need to add on all these things for it to be enough for me. I think there's nuance to everything, right? Like sometimes that student does need to slow down and just chill, and it doesn't always need to be the craziest class. But I think in today's world too, some people, we don't know what the rest of their life is. Maybe that's their only yoga class that they get to take all week, and if it isn't what they want it to be, like they're just going to do what they want. So yeah, I think if you see your class going super rogue, that's your sign of how can I layer up to what I had planned? How can I add in more challenge to what I had planned so the students who are craving that challenge get it?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Um, I'm going to pull you in a different direction because we're talking about inclusivity. And so I want to talk about accessibility because I feel it's linked to inclusivity as much. You can't practice, you can make a class inclusive if it's not accessible to everyone, or if the modifications that you're giving, they're not accessible enough. You can't, you can't include everyone. That's right. So as a teacher, how do you define accessibility in an asana practice? Like in a more practical way, what does that mean?
I think to put it simply, if something is accessible, that it allows every student to have a place to be. So no one feels like they have to sit out on the sidelines while everyone else does something that there's not something for them to have. So finding what is the simplest entry point that someone can be in and stay while you add on more layers of complexity for those who may want more challenge. And then as teacher, if you are demoing, I think it's important if you do demo the more complex layers that you don't stay in them, but rather once you've shown the most complex layer, you either get out of the pose and you stand and you look at your students and cue, or you even go back to the simplest option. Because those who took a more complex option, they'll stay there. But for anyone who's in a simpler option, if you as a teacher get back into that option, they feel like, oh, it's okay to be here. I'm still with the class
Yeah.
because the teacher is here with me. And sometimes even if you see students who look like they may benefit from pulling back, if you as the teacher then demo the pullback, they will follow. And I think that can help you be more accessible and inclusive. On a little side note to this, something I think is so important to do before class is connecting with your students beforehand and asking about their experience with yoga, injury history, anything going on with their body, etc. So that way you know what's going on with the people in the room. And if you know you have whatever plan for your sequence and someone has a limitation that might not work for a certain pose, a certain transition, you can give them something ahead of time. Oh, like, hey, we are going to have this in this class. Try this instead, and it may feel better in your body. That way, they get that little extra support. And I think even honesty from a teacher's perspective, and even like a studio or shala or wherever you're teaching, of who you even accept into the room, because depending on what's going on in the body, if we're getting super nuanced with it, some classes are not for everyone as much as we might want to be for everyone. If someone just had an open heart surgery, it's probably not a good idea. I'll never forget one time earlier in my teaching career, I was teaching at a gym and this older woman came in who still had her stitches from her open heart surgery. And I just told her, I was like, look, have you been cleared by a doctor? And she's like, no. And I was like, look, I don't think it's appropriate for you to take this class until you're cleared by a doctor. And she didn't listen to me, and I'll never forget. And she left very early. But even in just cat cow, like if you're doing cow, you're stretching here. And she was like making this excruciating face. And she left and she complained, but luckily management was on my side and was like, no, Maddie, you did the right thing by telling her like this class is not for her. And in some ways that's like for their safety. So in some extreme senses, you can't cater to everyone, but if it is an extreme case, they should have doctor approval. They probably would work best in a private, um, something of that sort than for everyone. But for the typical person who didn't just have an extreme surgery, I think we can meet a lot of people with the layers that we offer, slash that pre-class connection piece of maybe a specific student, you might give them a specific thing to know for that class. And I find they're always so grateful for that. Like, wow, that really helped with da da da. Yeah.
I want to understand what are the other layers that you stack upon, one upon the other when you are planning the sequence or when you're sharing it with your class. So, what are those like?
Mm-hmm. I think it's helpful to understand a concept from my, I often think of the asana practice from a kinesiology brain because I do have my bachelor's of science in kinesiology. So I can't separate the two since it is a movement practice. And there's something I'll put simply called lever arms. And so the longer a lever arm is, the more challenging it'll be. The shorter a lever arm is, the more accessible or easier it will be. So a simple way to look at this, it would be plank. Toe tucked plank is a longer lever arm. If you lower your knees down, you're shortening the lever arm so the plank gets easier. If you're in a crescent lunge and your knee's off the ground, again, your back leg has a longer lever arm. If you lower the knee down, you're shortening the lever arm, so it makes it easier. And I think if you understand this process as a teacher, it makes it easier to simplify things because that's one of the easiest way to simplify things is shorten the lever arm. And if something is too hard, how can you shorten the lever arm? Which in a lot of cases is lowering a knee down. Then I also like to look at how do we make a pose more simple or more complex. And so there's a few layers to this. Something that can increase complexity or simplify it is how much strength is required, how much flexibility or mobility is required, how much coordination or body awareness is required, and how much balance or stability is required. And so these are four elements we can play with to either make something more challenging or to make something simpler. So let's look at another pose. For example, we could take a twisted crescent lunge. And if you have your arms open, it will be a little bit easier for your students. If that looked too challenging, you could shorten the lever arm and have a student lower their back knee down. And if you wanted to make it more challenging, you can have them increase the twist by taking a crescent prayer twist. And if you wanted to increase the challenge again, you can choose maybe we add a bind because then that's increasing the challenge of their mobility. And if you wanted to increase the challenge again, you could guide them into Ekapada Vinyasa A from that position as well. Now
Mhm.
they're in an arm balance in the twist. So, like, do you see how we can make it so simple where it could be as simple as Parivrita Anjaneyasana with the arms out wide, or as complex as Ekapada Vinyasa A from just one pose. And you don't have to teach all the layers, but you can choose based on who is in the room. I always like to see, okay, if someone needs more support, we'll shorten a lever arm, we'll do something to make it require less strength, less balance, less coordination, etc. And then from there, I'll see, okay, how can I think it's important as teachers to challenge our students. And so I will see how many layers of challenge can I perhaps add for them. If it looks easy, if that looks accessible, could I add on another layer? And if we get to a point where it's like, maybe let's take another post, for example. Maybe you wanted to teach a class to king pigeon, and there's so many layers that you could teach, like an upright pigeon. And if maybe that's it, maybe you get your students into upright pigeon, and it's like there's no room for more. Like you can just call it there. It's okay if you don't get to your intended peak. Maybe you take them into some layers of a mermaid, whether it's just grabbing the foot with their hand or hooking it with their elbow or reaching one arm up or grabbing for the fingers. And you can choose like, okay, if you guided to reach the opposite arm up, but no one did, you don't need to keep teaching all the layers to get to here because no one's going for it. But if you got to here and people look spacious, it's like maybe we can teach the flip grip. But if no one got to here, I don't need to force teaching this, right? So I always like to think of the layers. If I teach the flip grip with one arm back and they still have one hand down to support them, and so people took this option and they look balanced and lifted, then I can guide this option. But if I take them here and their elbows flaring out and they're wobbling off to one side, I'm not going to give them this option because it looks like they're at that max range.
Yes.
So I think about all these layers in any pose that you can teach. And then based on who's there, you can choose to stay or to stop or to go back.
I think it's you've learned to read your students so well, and I think that system is so clear, which I think is very rare. But I'm pretty sure if any teacher out there follows your method, it's going to land so well. Okay, let's say if I'm a teacher in a class, in a Vinyasa class, um, and I'm bringing my student into a complex asana with a lot of steps, like mermaid pose. How much time should you give to a student to let her body figure the asana out on itself when when we are inside the class?
Do you mean in terms of before you add on the next layer or just for the total pose itself?
I think yes, for the next layer.
Yeah, I typically like to give students a breath to be in the pose before adding on the next layer, at least a breath. So I'll guide them there, I'll offer some refinements, and then I'll zip it. So longer than a breath, but I think like a breath of space before adding on what's next. And then I typically like to say, honor if this is a good place to stay. Or if you want, and then I'll give the why, they could take another option. So let's say they just grabbed the foot, take a breath here. And then after the breath, honor if this feels like a good place to stay. Or if you want a greater stretch for your back leg, see if you can hook your foot with your elbow. Pause, take a breath here, and then going into the layer. So they have a second to breathe into the shape and like feel what it feels like without noise of me speaking. I think silence is powerful as a teacher for students to be in the pose. And then giving the why is also powerful so they know why they're taking an option or choosing not to take the option. And I do like to through the layers more quickly, though, rather than giving them so much space, because for those who are wanting to take on more and more layers, sometimes one, either students might just rush into something and then they're like holding something really hard for like longer. And I always
Long
kind of laugh
time.
at this. I'm like, hey, I'm gonna get you there. Like, take your time. But also just thinking about someone who might be staying in a simpler layer, like how long they are holding things. And I know it's good to hold postures and to challenge ourselves, but sometimes there gets to a point where it's like, this is too long, where they've been in the discomfort too long and they just can't do it anymore. So I try to keep that in mind of timing, of keeping it so it's flowing. So then when we're at the final layer, we have some time to be there for everyone. That way, if someone does take the most complex layer, they're not just there for a second and then we're out because we're done. So I'd rather go through the layers a little bit more quickly and then give time for everyone to be in their final destination before we continue.
How long has it taken for you to reach this level of planning and execution that happens so fast in a class?
Well, I've been teaching for almost 12 years now. So I think it's like 12 years to get me to where I'm at today. I think it's always refining and growing and learning. I think every year that I teach, I learn more. And so I can't be like, oh, I got here 3 years ago. Because I think even who I was as a teacher a year ago is different than who I am today. And I think that's the beauty of it all is we get to continue to refine our craft by teaching, by learning. Yeah.
And so far, what has been the most challenging group for you to teach? For example, is it beginners or is it a certain age category or, let's say the most advanced practitioners? Like, let's say if any one of these groups is in a room, which group would it be most challenging to teach?
For me, I experienced this when I was living in Indonesia with that high tourism. And it was a unique experience where I was teaching students who did not speak English. And I think if you don't speak the language that your teacher is speaking, and especially if you're new. So before this, I loved working with beginners. I loved it all. I was in an interesting spot when I first started teaching, where I was teaching such a wide variety of students. Like I had college student regulars. I was working with 70 and up regulars and a different group. And then I also loved teaching like more challenging, powerful vinyasa flows. And I just love it all. And it really wasn't until I moved abroad. And then I used to really pride myself on being a skillful teacher in terms of cueing and how I could guide students and use my words to help support them. But then I was in a position where now my words mean nothing because they can't understand my language. And if they were someone who already had a practice, they can follow along a little bit more because they understand the asana practice. But if they were someone who was brand new to yoga and also did not speak English, that was so hard. It was very challenging. And honestly, at some points, frustrating for me because I felt like, how can I actually teach you if you don't understand what I'm saying? And so, in that point in my life, I ended up having to lean on, and I enjoy demoing things for students. I know that a lot of students are visual learners, but then more than ever, there were times where it's like I have to demo everything or they have no idea what is going on. So I think now that I'm doing more of my own thing rather than just working at a center, even though I do things abroad, I make it very clear like this is in English. I recommend being fluent in English because I think that for the students, it's a disservice if they can't understand you as well. So that was definitely the hardest group is just non-English speakers, with me being an English speaker.
I'm sure it sounds difficult. I'm just thinking, how did you get through the class? You had to do the whole flow with them?
Yeah, a lot of the times it was so interesting because again the tourism was such high turnover, and sometimes I did have people who spoke English and it was easier, but sometimes I would have like weeks where it felt like no one spoke English and everyone was brand new to yoga.
Wow.
And it was like, okay, we're just demoing literally everything because it was even interesting certain things like if you're teaching a vinyasa style class, the amount of classical vinyasa transitions that might be in that class. A typical person would pick up that it goes plank, chaturanga, dog, down dog. But sometimes these people would be like, okay, we've already done 5 vinyasas. And if I'm not doing the vinyasa with them, it is like not registering that like that's the motion that they're going through. So it's like, oh man, I really have to demo everything. So yeah, at least for me, I learned like that's not necessarily my dream student to have because I think I take a lot of I don't know if pride is the right word, but like care is maybe a better word. A lot of care as being someone's teacher, and maybe integrity is a better word. And being someone's teacher, that I actually want to teach them. And if I feel like I can't teach you, then that's hard.
That's I'm just curious to know this. With this group, how did you get the left and the right to coordinate? What was that like?
Just demo everything, make it as simple. The other interesting thing too was even like the front of the room, I would try to lean on things like that, like landmarks, the front of the room, the back of the
Mm.
room, like the bamboo wall. But even landmarks was not registering. I would be telling people to come to the front and people would be turning to the back. And so
Oh my God. What a nightmare it
chaos.
sounds like. My God.
Sometimes it was
But yeah,
chaotic. Like, I'm like turn to face, and in the past, I wouldn't like to use myself as a landmark because I feel like, oh, that's putting the attention on me and rather than their experience. But sometimes there, I felt like I had to use myself as a landmark. Like, turn to face me. If you don't see me, you're facing the wrong way.
okay. So if there is a beginner teacher who has maybe taken a bunch of classes so far, um, should she learn the cues verbally first or get better at them visually?
As a teacher, I think learning them verbally is really important to be able to articulate what you want to say to support your students. Because I think some teachers, especially newer, I think often the yoga student to yoga teacher pipeline is you're a student and you're doing all these shapes. And so you know the asanas. And so if you then don't take the time to refine the skill set of being able to articulate what you want to say, I think a common trap can be getting glued to the mat and doing the practice where then it almost becomes like they are watching you and they're following your practice rather than you are teaching them. So knowing that like you know how to do the pose, now can you speak it out loud so your students know how to do the pose? And with that, I think that the two can go together as well. If you get into the pose in your own body, then think like what are you doing in the pose and then how can you put that into words for your students to do that as well. So sometimes by embodying it yourself as a newer teacher, you can then think, okay, how can I say what I'm physically doing? And that can help if you're just, rather than just sitting there and being like, all right, how am I going to cue warrior two? Like if you're a new teacher, like get into warrior two and then what are you doing in warrior two? And then speak that out loud and that can go together to help you find your words. I was going to say, I think
Go
it's
ahead.
a common misconception where teachers think that they have to be able to do the most complex asanas to teach them. And that's just not true. And something that I think helps you realize this is if you look at any professional athlete, for example, like Simone Biles, Michael Phelps, Michael Jordan, like all these incredible athletes, their coaches are not an athlete at the level that their athlete is, but they have the knowledge and they're able to apply it to the athlete to get their athlete to such incredible levels. The same thing comes to teaching yoga. You do not need to be the most advanced asana practitioner and have the greatest strength and flexibility if you know how to understand the biomechanics of a pose and how to articulate that clearly for your student and spot the compensation patterns in their body and use your words to help them refine it, then you can teach students who are beyond your physical capabilities. You can teach any pose, even if you can't do it yourself. So I think if you're wanting to focus on your teaching skill set, working on that, of course, you can continue to work on your own physical skill set, but I don't think they have to go together.
I think I'll get a t-shirt with this written on it because I completely agree to your approach. It's just, I wish a lot of people would understand this, that um, I think putting yourself out there visually is also not sustainable when,
Yes.
right, when it's your career, it's full time. At some point, you will tire yourself out. And I learned it the hard way.
I think we all learned that one the hard way, where it's like, oh, I can't teach and demo this amount of classes. Like that is just not sustainable. And especially poses where your students can't see you. Or I think really any pose, we don't need to hold it with them. We can be the demo and then get out of the pose.
That's true. That's true. Um, is there a certain cue, a yoga cue that you say and you make it most clear, and your students receive that cue, but they're not able to embody it? You don't see it in their bodies.
Hmm. I think that there are that happens sometimes, but I don't think it's necessarily a cue. And so I think something that's helpful for teachers is thinking about multiple different ways that you can say the same thing, but differently. And one way to approach this is looking at a posture more structurally versus muscularly. So, a really common example would be helping students with an anterior pelvic tilt where their butt is popping back, right? You could tell your students to tilt their tailbone down and squeeze their rib cage in, but some students tilt your tailbone down doesn't make sense. You could also, if you see that and it didn't happen, I think sometimes you'll hear teachers repeat the same cue. They say a cue and it doesn't land. And so then they repeat the same thing, but just repeating the same thing is probably not going to help the student figure it out because they heard it the first time, but it didn't register. So think, how else could I get that same action? So instead of telling them to tilt their tailbone down, you could tell your students to squeeze your butt cheeks down towards your heels. Then, oh, that light bulb might go off of like, oh, squeeze my butt cheeks down. And then you can see that shift happen. So if I say a cue and it doesn't land, I always think, what's a different way I could communicate the same thing so maybe it does land? Another silly example that, again, I didn't experience until I was teaching abroad full time was to untuck your toes. I feel like when I was teaching English speakers, people knew what it meant to tuck or untuck, but people who English wasn't their first language, they were not sure about which one was tuck and which one was untuck. And if I were to just repeat untuck your toes, it would not land. And so I came up with the cue that I still use now, which is funny, but so clear. And it worked every time was press your toenails to the floor. They knew what their toenails were.
Oh, yeah.
So press your toenails down. When I was teaching, I spent the first decade of my career teaching in California. I never thought of pressing your toenails to the ground because the untuck cue always worked. But when I moved abroad, it no longer worked. And so I was like, how else can I communicate what it's like? I'm like, toenails.
Yeah, I think I'm going to steal that one for my class. But it's genuinely so clear. Yeah, I mean, I wish more teachers understood that, firstly, that they can change their queuing if one queue is not working. Um, is there a certain queue that you feel isn't particularly reliable or it doesn't work? Like, for example, mm, tucking the tailbone in a backbend. Some people feel it's good, some feel it doesn't help. So, anything like that, if you've had.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of yoga myths out there or things anatomically that don't make sense. right? Like tucking your tailbone and some things don't make sense, or there's certain like fear mongering things like you don't place your foot against your knee in tree pose. And it's like, that's fine to do. Or another one that doesn't make sense is to protect your knee in pigeon, flex your big toe back towards your knee. But if you understand anatomy, you understand if you draw your big toe towards your knee, that's dorsiflexion, but your dorsiflexors do not cross over your knee joint. And so working dorsiflexion isn't going to do anything to protect your knee. It's still a good cue to fire up along the anterior chain. I still use the cue, but not to protect your knee. So I think there's a lot of nuancy things. Even square your hips in warrior one. That's not going to be physically possible for most people because the back foot is grounded down. So there's certain things like that that I think as we learn more, we can I think it's important as a teacher to have some discretion. I think there's a lot of yoga myths that float around in the space, and just because their teacher said it, then they believe that it is true, rather than like questioning if something is true or not. So always just having a little discretion, like, does this make sense? And just because your yoga teacher said it's true doesn't mean that it is true. On a similar kind of side tangent on that, something that I lean away from that I used to do more when I was a new teacher. When I was a new teacher, I was in the middle of getting my kinesiology degree. So I was around this terminology all the time, and it was like very normal in our conversations. And so I used to use more anatomical cues, but that doesn't make sense to students who don't know anatomy. So, for example, I used to use like internal rotation and external rotation a lot, or internally rotate, externally rotate. But for someone who does not know anatomy, they don't know what that means. And so, how can I explain that action? And if I wanted to educate, I could add, for example, dial your pinkies in to work external rotation at your shoulder. I could add that at the end, or I could choose not to, depending on the setting. But if I just say, or like externally rotate your thigh, how could I guide them to spiral your thigh outwards? That cue in layman's terms makes more sense. Or even with muscle groups, I used to like call muscles by their name more. And now if I want to do that, I will always say what it is first, where it is first. Like feel the back of your thigh, your hamstrings fire up, rather than just say feel your hamstrings fire up. Because some students they don't know where that is, and I think sometimes when you're so in this movement world, you think everyone knows. And for me, a lot of these lessons I learned from students being like, "What's external rotation?" or "I feel so stupid. I don't know what the glutes are," and you keep talking about the glutes all class. So I've steered away from those words more, and if I do use them, I always say what it is and then name drop.
Yeah, I think I have been through that as well. Um, so let's say if you are queuing or planning your class, or even if you're taking your class, um, how much weightage do you give to being technical in terms of what you speak, and how much on keeping it simple? Like, how do you decide where
I
to go?
typically like to keep it simple unless it's in a training type environment where people are there for education. But if they're just there to take a group class, I think simplifying things is often better because one, everyone's able to understand what you are saying. And two, sometimes if you're adding on so much technical to it, you're taking up space that could just be quiet. And so I think that having silence is so important. And so I'm always mindful of like, is this necessary to say? And or would it be more powerful if I just let the mic drop? But if I am in a more training environment, whether it's a workshop or I'm hosting a teacher training, then that's where I will add in more of that technical for learning purposes, because that's what they're there for. So I think it depends on the setting and why are people there.
Yeah, I think that's it's very relevant. It's the group that decides which path or which kind of terminology you pick up more. Um, you mentioned silence as being something really important. Uh, what are those moments in a class where silence becomes non-negotiable, or it's really important to say nothing?
Yeah, I think it's really important throughout the class. And I kind of like to think of it as a thread that gets woven out. So in the beginning of class, I'm such a huge fan of having time to, of course, guide students into their breath, but then also giving them space and silence to just be with their breath and like settle into that experience. Then throughout the class, typically in the beginning of class, we're warming up, so we might be moving a little more dynamically. There might not be as much space, but once we get into the class and we're past that dynamic part, I think that whenever I'm done cueing a pose and helping students refine their shapes, I think it's always important to at least zip it for a full breath. You can, of course, take more breaths, but rather than finishing your last refinement cue and immediately moving on to what's next, pausing and just taking a breath as a teacher, I think is such a helpful tool for you being able to give silence. Because I think a lot of times, especially for newer teacher, silence can feel really loud. Like, oh my gosh, everyone is looking at me for what's next. But if you think about it as a student, if you've ever taken a class where a teacher never shuts up, it's exhausting and often feels fast. It's like, oh my gosh, like it's just go, 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 go. So reminding yourself, like, wait, like when this teacher finally stops talking, that gives you space to like land and be. So it's a good thing. And to help you not rush the silence, you just pause and then keep it going. So there's that silence woven in. Of course, depending on what style you're teaching, you could give more breaths, but at least a breath. And then while you get in towards the latter half of class where you're cooling things down, less is more and more space and silence for students to just be. And then especially for Shavasana, like zip it. Like do not be talking throughout Shavasana. Give us time to just be ignited. I think Shavasana is a beautiful opportunity to practice pratyahara or sensory withdrawal. And how can you withdraw from your senses if someone is just talking to you the whole time? So just definitely zip it for all of Shavasana. And yeah, that's how I like to think of weaving in silence throughout the class.
If I am practicing a vinyasa and this is through a YouTube video, what are the things that would make a vinyasa flow on YouTube a good flow? If I'm someone who doesn't know anything about flow at all.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the simplest way to look at it is how did the flow and the energy of the teacher through the screen make you feel? If we're just to put it as simple as possible. Like, did you feel held through the experience? Did the class feel good in your body? Or were there things where it felt like, oh, I couldn't do this. This felt too hard or too fast. Or this teacher had weird energy. I didn't like their voice. Or like, it could be so many things. But yeah, I think really connecting to how it makes you feel would be the most important thing. And if the cool thing is there's so many teachers out there. So if you take a yoga class, whether it's in person or online, and you just didn't like it, go find a different one. Like find a different teacher, find a different format, play around with like, oh, like if this class is like, oh my gosh, I love this. This teacher was amazing. Like I felt so good afterwards. Then that's a great class for you, regardless of how technically great the class was. I think feeling matters more than a lot of even teachers realize. How we make our students feel is so important. I think even more important than how skilled you are. Because you could be a really skilled teacher, but if you show up with bad energy and you don't connect with your students and they don't feel seen, then I don't think you are a good teacher, regardless of the skill set.
What does it mean to make a student feel seen in a class? If there were, let's say, three or four things.
One, going back to what I said earlier, but I think it's really important to take a moment to connect with your students before class. And it could be literally as simple as welcoming them to class and telling them what props to grab. And if that person grabs their props and sits down and closes their eyes in meditation, like just let them have their moment. But then there's always going to be the student who like sits on their mat and they're just like staring at you. Like go and connect with them, like get to know their name, like get to know about them, their practice. And if they're a regular, then begin to like, I think it's get to express interest in who they are. And that really helps them feel seen and like they're part of this community and like you really care for them as a teacher throughout the class experience, looking at your students. I'm definitely a fan of facing my students. I know some teachers face the mirror, but I think that creates disconnection. And again, more of like, oh, we're following you rather than like you're teaching us. So eye contact and again, teaching in those layers to what you see. If you see someone who's like, I think of course challenge is good, right? But then there's a point where challenge is beyond what someone could even handle. And so if you see someone struggling, how can you give them something that they can do to help take down the challenge? And that way it's still challenging for them, but actually accessible for their current level. Looking at your students, making eye contact, teaching in layers to what you actually see happening. And whenever you are refining shapes, taking the time to say whatever you want to refine and then watching it actually land in their body and even complimenting what you see, like beautiful adjustments, like notice how that should feel, something like that. So they feel like, oh, like they saw me, they were speaking to me and I made the adjustment and they noticed it. Like that really helps them feel like, wow, like I feel like one of my favorite compliments I get from students is just something so simple, but they're like, "Oh, I feel like you're really talking to me." I'm like, "Yeah, because I
Yeah.
am," rather than just like rambling off fluff and like not giving your students a second to register. So slowing down that presence with them and then closing out the class experience, some connection after class while students are leaving, like just great job in class today. If someone's new, checking in how class was. If someone told you at the start of class they had an injury, like, oh, how's your shoulder holding up? Or if you had a regular for a while, you've seen them trying for crow pose forever and they finally got it, like, oh my gosh, you got crow pose, great job. It's like all these little things that we could do as a teacher to really help our students feel seen. That like just go, it's little things, but it goes a long way in helping them want to come back for more of the practice.
For such a connection to establish, how many students should a group class have? Like, what is that number above which you cannot connect with your class? All of us
Yeah.
have a limited capacity to make our students feel seen. So what's that like for you?
I have a different number depending on the setting. So if it's a teacher training, I cap my teacher trainings at 12 students. Even though I know some people like to take on more students, I think 12 for me is the max where I feel like I can actually give every teacher trainee good attention and the care that they deserve. And if it gets more than that, then I know that the quality is just going to go down. And for me, like I'd rather have smaller training containers than huge ones because I think the quality for me really matters. For retreats, I can go a little bit bigger because I think it's a little less intensive in like the learning aspect. So retreats, though, I even don't like to go that big. Like for me, 15 is really cozy. If it gets bigger than 15, I just feel like it's seeping out in too many different directions. For a class, like just a general group class, I feel like 35 I can handle where it feels like I'm still able to connect with everyone in the room and see everyone. If it gets much bigger than that, then that's where it starts to be like, okay, I might have missed something going over way over there and I didn't see it until like too late. I wish I would have seen that sooner. So 35 for me, I feel like I can hold, but if it gets bigger than that for just a drop-in group class, that's when it's like, whoa, this is a lot of people.
35 is huge, but I feel like
Yeah.
the kind of energy that you have, 35 makes a lot of sense, man. And I think that's wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, it could be fun, the energy of a big class. But I've heard of some people with whose spaces allow for more, or even in the different festival type settings. And I'm like, wow, that could be fun, but I could definitely see how as a teacher it would be harder to like really give as much care and support to every student.
Like according to you as a practitioner, what's a good class, a good yoga class?
So again, this is my opinion because I definitely am quite particular in what I want in a class. I think a good rule of thumb for anyone is just how did the teacher make you feel? How did the class make you feel? If you left feeling good, it was a good class, and it could be as simple as that. But for me, what I like love in a class, and if the teacher can deliver all of this, like I will be such a loyal student to them. Is I love a class that starts with just breath and time to like actually breathe. It's not rushed and time to be quiet in that breath. I love chanting and mantras. I love a class that's going to challenge me physically. And it doesn't have to be fast. Like holding things is challenging, but I want that physical challenge. And I also like doing things that I may not have done before, but the teacher has to be able to skillfully cue me there. I love hearing cues. I love alignment focused teachings. And so if you can skillfully cue me into doing something I haven't done in my body before, obsessed. And then I also love when a teacher can bring that more factor, where we pull in more than just the asanas. So I love if they could skillfully weave in a theme into the class. I love when they bring in pranayamas for us to practice, chanting, mudras. I love all of those aspects where they can like add a little bit more depth. So it's not just an asana practice, but it feels a little bit more complete. And then a long, quiet shavasana. Yeah. um, if a teacher has all those things in their class, obsessed. Like that's such a great class. But that's where I'm at now. And I think something that anyone could take away is did the class make you feel good? Did the teacher make you feel good? Then that's good as is. But those are some important ones for me. And I think one more is that I like finding teachers that I feel like I can learn from. I want to find someone who I'm like, ooh, they're like above where I am at. And sometimes as you get further down this teaching path, sometimes that gets harder to find, but they're out there. And so keep finding the teachers that inspire you and that you feel like you could really learn from.
Absolutely. I think the best place is to find them on a podcast somewhere in the world because so many are doing that
Yeah,
as well.
I'll shout out a great teacher. If anyone is traveling to Koh Phangan, Thailand, there's a teacher named Eden. He's incredible. He delivers on all of those things, and he's one of my favorite teachers to practice with. He does such a good job of holding that space. Yeah, Koh Phangan, Thailand. Find Eden. He's at least the last time I was there was at Yoga House, and I think the other one's called Orion. But yeah, shout out to Eden.
So, if let's say there is a practitioner out there who feels that she's ready to become a teacher and she's looking for a teacher training on the internet, and also because there are plenty of teacher trainings out there in the world, and a lot of people struggle to find what's right. So, what are the ways in which a practitioner can decide that this teacher training is worth trusting and it's worth the investment of energy, um, just by looking at, let's say, the website or just the general idea you get from looking at the teachers, the way that they train? What would those ways be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say to one, think about what style of yoga do you like? And if you don't know, but let's say there's a teacher that you really like, you can ask them, like, hey, I love your classes. I think I want to do a teacher training. Do you have a recommendation of like what style are you teaching? Because I want to be trained in that. Because sometimes students they just take yoga classes and they don't really know what they're taking or what they like, but they're like, I like this teacher. So ask that teacher. Like, and maybe even that teacher has a recommendation of a training that they did, or maybe they run trainings, and then you can find a training that way. So figure out like what do you like, and then go find a training that's for that specific thing, because there's so many styles of trainings. Then I think also asking yourself what is the vibe for the container of the training. So there's different approaches to doing a teacher training. There's online, which personally is not my thing, and I think is a little bit of a disservice, especially if it's your first teacher training for it to be all online. I think if you want to teach, it'll be really hard to then get from behind a screen to in person and teach, but that is an option some people might want. There's also the extended trainings where it's happening over several months and it's happening on the weekends and you still have your full job that you're doing. And I know for some people that works really well and serves them in their schedule and their lifestyle. And so that's the way to go. For me, that's also not the vibe because it just seems like there's so much going on. It's hard to really drop in. What my personal favorite is the immersive experience where you get to like go away somewhere for a month or however long and like get immersed in living, breathing, sleeping, teaching yoga. For me, that's my personal favorite, but I also know it's not accessible to everyone to just leave their life and go off and do that. But there's different styles. And so asking yourself, like, what style do you want to go to and like finding that style. If you are doing an immersive one, knowing that however many hours it is however many hours you're training. So breaking that down into however many weeks it is, right? I run teacher trainings, and my 200 hours are across 4 weeks. And I know many that do it in shorter, like 3 weeks, or some even 2 weeks. And I don't even understand how they do that or how you're able to absorb all of that as a student. If you're doing a 200 hour in 2 weeks, that's 100 hours a week, right?
It's
If you're doing
crazy.
it in 3 weeks, right, that's maybe 75. Versus if it's in four, that's still 50 hours a week. That's a lot. But for me, I'm like, I would never do it shorter than 4 weeks because I just don't think that's holdable for a student to really grow and transform and like actually absorb it all and then fly. I think the 2 weeks or 3 weeks for me personally, I think they're a little rushed, but maybe someone else likes that. So there's just different lengths of those, and that's something to be aware of. After you figured out like, okay, what type of training do I want to do? What style of training do I want to do? I think it's really important to look into who are you being trained by and who is like the primary trainer. Some teacher trainings have just one sole trainer, others have a team of trainers, and you want to find out from that team of trainers like, is the head trainer who you're actually being trained by, or are you being trained by all the assistants? And if possible, seeing if you could connect with whoever the lead trainer is that you are going to be spending the most amount of time learning from, and see if like, do you connect with their energy and their vibes and their philosophy and like who they are, or did you get on a call with them and did it feel like, like I just didn't quite vibe with this person, because you're going to be spending however many hours learning from them. And so if there's like something that feels off about that person specifically, like who is leading the training makes a really big impact on your experience. If you've felt connected to certain trainings and you're curious and you want to like connect, you can also look at testimonials and see like what have other people said about this training. And if you're liking what they're saying and you're liking the format and the duration and all of that, then I would say like that's the person to see like, can I actually connect with the lead facilitator? I know not everyone does that, but I think those who do it also shows you like the level of care that they bring to their
That's true.
trainings. The last part I would say is also asking about how many people they accept. Um, some trainings can be huge and have like 30 plus people in there, and then other trainings are more intimate. So asking yourself, like, do you want a big sea of people that you're training with, or do you want a more intimate group? So those are some ways that you can begin to like lead into like what is the right one. But I think once you found one that you're like, I like the style, I like the type, I love the teacher and their energy, then just trust your gut and just go for it.
Then yeah, that's probably the best way to make a decision at the end of it all. Let's say if there is a practitioner who wants to become good at teaching and is more serious about getting qualified, but also not just qualified, but like really good with technique. Um, how do you spot a teacher's training that offers exactly that and is not going to just be a good experience? Is that making
Yes,
sense?
that's such a good question. Such a good question. I'm happy you mentioned that because I didn't even think to speak on that. But it's huge because there's so much to yoga, right? And so a teacher training can dive into so many things and like skip the skill set of like you becoming a teacher, but you learned a lot about yoga. And so if you want to become a skilled teacher where you leave that teacher training and you're like, I'm ready to start teaching, the biggest thing to look for and to ask about is practicum. So how much are you actually practicing teaching yoga? And if the training is like, oh, you have one practicum at the end, it's your final, do you think you're going to feel prepared to teach after teaching one class? Probably not.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you have a training where there's a big focus on practicum, like for me with my 200 hours, my intention is I want people to graduate and feel like they can go teach, whether they want to teach or not. I know some people just do it for the experience, but everyone who goes through, I want them to feel like they can actually go off and teach. And a lot of my teachers do. They go off and they start teaching right away. And the reason is I make them teach every single day. From day one, you are teaching every day. We're still learning a lot, but then you're also applying everything that you're learning throughout the whole thing. So that way, by the time your training's done, you've taught a ton. And you're like, oh, like I feel like a teacher. Like I can go and teach. I can keep refining and getting better and better, but like I know how to teach. But if it's like, oh, there's no practicums or just one practicum at the end, oh, that's going to be hard. And I think that's a huge reason why a lot of people graduate from their 200 hour and they don't feel ready to teach yet. It's like, oh, well, how much did you teach? And it's like, oh, we didn't teach or we taught at the very end. That's why. So if you just want the experience, you're like, I for sure don't want to teach. You can just find one for the vibes and the experience and to learn more about yoga. And there's a lot of value to that. But if you're someone who like, I want to teach, or you think like maybe I want to teach, finding one where practicum is a component of it will definitely be helpful. And then I guess second to that would be the testimonials that you see are people
Mhm.
talking about how they felt confident to teach. Do they have success stories of teachers out there? Then that would be like the secondary thing.
That's really helpful, especially for a new practitioner or a teacher to really figure out how many hours of practicum is the training promising. Is that how to look for it?
Yeah, asking how
Okay.
many hours or how many times, like, are we actually practice teaching, not just practicing, but how many hours or how much of the time, how often do I get to practice teaching? And that will give you so much insight of like, will you feel ready to teach? And I know it can feel scary on day one if your teacher's like, all right, you're going to practice teaching, but getting that fear out of the way during the training is going to be so much more helpful than like waiting until you're done and then doing it for the first time. And then you have that fear and then you're thrown out into the world. Oh, I
Please
was
go
just gonna
ahead.
say I definitely like adopted that mindset from my first training. My teacher, Johnny, unfortunately he's not teaching anymore, but he was amazing and he made us teach every day. And I was so grateful for that because I think that really gave me a strong start. And I had experience before I made my own school running other studios, like their school. They wanted me to like be the lead facilitator. And so I had to do their program. And I noticed this gap of them not getting the students to teach right away or like not having as much teaching. And then it becoming more of a challenge if there's these big gaps between when they teach before the next time they get to teach, it's harder to continue to build versus if you're teaching all the time, you're getting the skill set. It's kind of like learning a language. I think learning to teach yoga is like learning how to speak another language. And if you're learning to speak another language, you got to practice every day. If you practice here and there, it's going to be hard to pick it up every time you're learning it. But if you practice every
That's
day, you're
true.
going to start picking it up more and more.
Makes perfect sense. Okay. I'm going to come to the final question, which I call as asan as in. Um, let's say you had never learned asan in a book or at a school, and all that you knew about teaching and doing asanas was through your own practice. How would you describe asan?
I would describe it as a way home to yourself. Yeah, way home to yourself. I think asana is a beautiful practice for being able to peel back these layers to yourself and really learn a lot about yourself and the present moment and getting you to actually be here and not having your mind wander everywhere else. And if I were to take it further, I often like to think of asana as the gateway for a couple levels. One, it's just the gateway into yoga for so many people. And I'm okay with it being the gateway if it pulls people in, and maybe they stay in that gateway and it's still the gateway into more connection with themselves and the present moment and embodiment. And then for others, it's the gateway deeper into the layers of yoga where it's like, ooh, this asana practice is really great. And what else is there? And they dive deeper down what all yoga has to offer. So I also think of it as the gateway.
I think that's beautiful. It's quite accurate and beautiful at the same time. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Uh, I wish that everyone hears this out because you brought so much clarity to the process of teaching.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been so lovely connecting with you. Thanks for having me on. It's been fun. And thanks for your kind words. I appreciate it. I'm glad to share some of what I've learned along the way.